One organization who is actively fighting child trafficking is Project Karma, a non-government organization focused on disrupting crime network of children trafficking. Now, present with me today here is Glen Hulley, the founder and face of Project Karma. Glen, thank you for joining us here. Thank you for coming to Indonesia and to the perspective. Could you share with us a little bit of the background that moved you to, initiate this project in the beginning in Australia?
Sure. I have a background in policing in Australia. I was a member of Victoria Police for nearly 13 years. But I found myself on a holiday about nearly 4 years ago now. And I was in a place in Cambodia where I was approached by a tuk-tuk driver who initially offered a child to have sex with. And I honestly didn't believe that at first, and I was curious about the nature of his proposal, and I took him up on his offer of going with him and finding out who this child was and where they were. And I was taken to this place, and I was basically introduced to a 12-year-old girl that for around $20 US I could take back to my hotel room.
So that was your first encounter with the issue, almost unplanned, but it moved you. And when you came back to Australia, what did you do? How did you start this?
Yeah, look, it affected me greatly. We actually went to a second place after that where I had the choice of a 4-year-old girl.
No.
And that was quite shocking. I was able to extricate myself from that situation, and I was taken back to the place where I initially met the driver. And I didn't pursue the matter any further. But I visited a number of other countries after that around Southeast Asia, and I found that if I wasn't approached, I only had to ask, and it was quite easy to get access to a child.
Wow.
And so this really stuck with me on my holiday, and then when I went back to Australia, I couldn't shake what I'd seen.
Yeah.
And so I was in a position of flux in my life where I was deciding what I wanted to do with my next chapter. And I decided that this would be something that I wanted to pursue. So I did some research, I found some organisations that were combating these types of crimes, and I made some inquiries, and before long I was made an offer to go over to Cambodia. Okay. And I provided some consultation to some police and some non-government organisations in relation to investigative training. My background, my whole career has been in investigation. Yeah. I was a detective with Victoria Police, and I also worked in plainclothes and undercover type of covert operations. So I lent my skills to those organisations in Cambodia, and that led to me getting a job with an organisation, a Dutch organisation here in Jakarta, which saw me overseeing 12 investigation teams in 6 countries, looking into investigating these types of crimes and working with the police to obtain arrests and rescue children. I found that there were a lot of holes in the models that were being employed, and I couldn't find a way to convince the organisations that I was consulting with or working for to change the way they were going about it. So I decided to go back to Australia. I consulted with a number of people in the industry, and they convinced me that I should start my own charity, my own organisation, and I developed what we call the Sentinel model, which is now what we're piloting in Bali, and soon to begin piloting in Cebu in the Philippines.
Wow. How did people back in Australia, when you started to initiate this into the Sentinel model that fits more into the targets and goals that you set, how did people react in the beginning? Is it a rather shocking fact that somebody actually spoke up and do this in a more engaging ways?
Yeah, I
victims,
find,
I suppose, also.
Absolutely. I find most people it's quite shocking and confronting. It's a topic that is very emotive, but it's also a topic that's not spoken about a lot. So it's quite shocking when somebody hears about it for the first time, especially the scale of which it's occurring. There is actually a lot of good data out there. There's some organisations that have spent a lot of time and effort in researching and collating the statistics and the data about the scale of this problem. But there's a breakdown on where and how that data gets distributed and promoted amongst the community and governments. And so when I do find myself talking to people about this, it's quite often that it's quite shocking for many people.
If you could share with us, what was behind all this? Why did people seem to, reluctant at the beginning, either to report or to confess that they were the victims. What held them back, Glenn? Because it's devastating. Child trafficking and you know, for sexual purposes, like.
Yeah. Sexual abuse of children is a very taboo topic in most cultures, Western and Eastern. It's a topic that most people don't want to talk about. Most people don't endorse it and are totally against it, but they don't want to hear about it. It's quite shocking. It's quite confronting, and it's been a taboo topic for a long time, and that's unfortunate because that's exactly what makes it easier for people to commit these crimes. So we think that bringing awareness is one of the major keys in getting people talking about this issue. Victims find it hard to report these matters. We know from the statistics and the data that's shown that only about 1 in 5 children that are victims of these crimes will actually report that they've been they have been abused, and then that's because of the shame that they feel. Quite often an offender engages in what we call grooming with a child, where a level of trust is built up over a period of time, and so the offender has a manipulation over that child and can threaten them in the way of that something bad's going to happen to them or to the offender themselves or to their parents or their family if they tell somebody, and so the child begins to feel guilty. There's a level of shame and therefore reluctance to want to tell somebody, even though they know what's happening to them is not right and they're not happy about it. And that tends to then compound the problem, and they become even more emotionally scarred. And we see depression and issues that are affecting the child's well-being, mental and physical well-being. Yeah,
and it really imprisoned them mentally and psychologically with all this guilt, concepts that is against their nature as children, as humans. And how did this movement then also being responded by the government in Australia, Glenn? It's a very interesting success story, if we may, that government, the law finally sided to accept this and to involve this protection to children.
Yes, it's become quite an issue in Australia over the last number of years, and the government has enacted a number of laws and funding and resources into prevention and also investigation of these types of crimes, both at a local level and also within trafficking side of things with organised crime. However, there was still, and there still is, many gaps that need to be addressed. And one of the stark gaps that we found was in 2015, I was given some data in relation to the Australian Child Sex Offender Register and how many registered child sex offenders were travelling out of Australia to a number of countries in Southeast Asia.
Right.
And what we found was most people weren't even aware that the people on this register were even allowed to travel. Most people were of the impression that once you've harmed a child and you've gone to jail for that and you've been put on a monitoring register, that your right to travel would be gone. But that wasn't the case, and the law did allow these people to travel. They only had to notify the Australian Federal Police of their intent to travel, and more often than not they would be granted permission. And the only steps that were taken was that the Australian Federal Police would notify the inbound country that this person was coming, and they would be relying on the immigration of that country to determine whether or not they'd allow the person entry to the country. Right. And we found that in 2015 there was over 250 Australian registered child sex offenders that entered the Philippines. Wow. We found that on average it was 25 registered child sex offenders from Australia entering Bali every month, which is nearly one a day. And so to me it was common sense, is that if a person's been identified as harming a child, has been punished for it and put on a register to be monitored, then why would we allow them to get on a plane with a pocket full of money and go to a country that's a developing nation where there's a lot of poverty, a lot of these types of crimes are happening, it's known for it, and we allow them to get on a plane and go over there not knowing where they're going to go, what they're going to do, and we're relying on another agency as to whether or not they're going to allow entry. And clearly they were allowing entry, because we know that there was nearly one a day going into Bali. So there was also an article that was released by News Corp back in 2015, where they had some research data sent to them that showed that the Australian Federal Police said that Bali was the #1 child sex destination for Australian sex offenders and pedophiles. So, you know, we were very concerned the fact that Australia has, like every country, has a duty of care, not just for the citizens in their own country, but citizens going to other countries. And so I approached a man at the time who was a media personality, a long background, over 30 years in journalism in Australia, a radio show and TV current affairs program. His name was Darren Hinch. And after a while, he eventually decided to meet with me, and we had a coffee, and he wrote an article after that in relation to what I shared with him. And he was quite shocked that, that this was occurring. And so he decided to go public, you know, with what I'd shared with him. The long story short was that he decided to go into politics not long after that, and he ended up being voted in as a senator. And he took this on as his #1 priority on getting into office, that we wanted to stop registered child sex offenders leaving the country. And that law became mandated 2 months ago in Australia. It only took 7 months to occur, and as of now, registered child sex offenders can't leave the country, which is a world first, and we're lobbying other governments around the world to adopt the same policy.
Very inspiring. We need to put a little break and catch up with the next topic. Stay with us on The Perspective.